If there was one criticism that followed the Far Cry series in 2015, it was probably the same criticism that followed Assassin's Creed, a lack of change. Far Cry Primal showcased Ubisoft's ability to change the aesthetics, but the gameplay was even more like its predecessor than Far Cry 4 was. It was clear that the series needed a change, and thankfully, we got a change that was less, hey, let's make an RPG, and more, hey, let's keep the series core while also moving it forward. When reshaping a series, specific care needs to be given to how quickly that series changes, and in what ways. You can't uproot the entire identity just because we're being too repetitive, and you can't change so little that it feels like we haven't learned our lesson. Far Cry 5 strikes the perfect balance in this sense, as it changes enough to feel significantly iterative, but it never feels like anything else but Far Cry. The most we could criticize the game is in how it sets the trend going forward, a trend that would leave the series in its current state, which sadly is much like Assassin's Creed, split. The first change is the scenery. We are no longer playing as a foreigner, because our avatar is now a blank slate, and for the average Western gamer, a majority of the franchise's players, the farmlands of the Bible Belt is not as foreign as the dangers of the Rook Islands or the hodgepodge of Hindi Himalayan mountains of Kirat. This could have significant consequences for the gameplay loop, and fortunately, the impact it does have is positive. As far as iterations go, instead of 1 or 2 antagonists, we now get 4 major antagonists that all have their share of screen time and allow the player to be critiqued and challenged in different ways. These days, Far Cry 5 is looked back upon fondly, and not without reason, and this video will attempt to discern exactly why people love Far Cry 5 all these years later. Deep in Oregon, there lies a town named Harney County, and within it, for generations there has been tension between cattlers and the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. These tensions eventually led to 2 cattlers being arrested for arson in protest to tensions over land ownership. Some believe this arrest to be unwarranted, and Ammon Bundy was one of them. During an initially peaceful protest, Bundy convinced a portion of the protesters to march towards the refuge headquarters and occupy it for over 40 days. This occupation garnered widespread coverage, drawing in opinions from people who sympathized with Bundy's anti-government sentiment, those that felt it was a brash act of defiance, and everywhere in between. While the militants were all eventually arrested, the situation still stands as a landmark story of separatist protest for the state of Oregon. This was one of many stories to inspire Far Cry 5. Development of Far Cry 5 began shortly after development for Primal concluded, and while its development was mostly standard, running on the Dunia 2 engine, what interests me more about Far Cry 5 is what happened after its release. Far Cry 5 was met with much controversy because, while its story was written between 2014 and 2016, its political themes were eerily similar to certain political events taking place in real-life America at the same time. Far Cry has almost always been a series with political themes, but not often had they gone into specifics. Far Cry 4 looked plenty at power, control, tradition, and progress, aiming to critique those in positions of power and what it takes to achieve that power. 5 takes aim at separatism, religion, and what happens when those ideologies are taken to their extreme. This was met with significant backlash, with some claiming it demonized religion, and even some petitions requested that the antagonist be changed to a Muslim. No, that is not a joke. It makes sense that you'd critique a game far harsher when it takes place in your backyard, but as we'll see, a lot of the criticism and sometimes even praise Far Cry 5 gets is unearned. Over the last few years, deep in Montana, a group called the Project at Eden's Gate has begun congregating and further rising within Hope County. Already, a town like this wished to be left to their own devices, driven by separatism and their faith in the Christian Lord. At the cult's head was Joseph Seed, a man who heard God's voice, a man that knew a rapturous event known as the Collapse was coming, and that the family needed to prepare. Eden's Gate was being monitored by the authorities, though it was difficult to disband the cult because its members were present by their own will. And while some theorized that the cult was up to illegal activity, there wasn't enough proof to back it up. Until today, after some bloggers had successfully exposed what was going on inside Eden's Gate, Marshal Cameron Burke, Sheriff Earl Whitehorse, and 3 deputies, Deputy Joey Hudson, Deputy Stacy Pratt, and you, the rookie, began flying in to Hope County. Ready to speak the language of faith, bliss, and, I don't know, maybe French or something. Hey, did you know that Mondly has a massive sale right now where you can get 65% off a lifetime purchase by using the link in the description? If you haven't heard of one of the world's most downloaded language apps, Mondly provides its 125 million users the ability to learn hundreds of different languages from the comfort of their own home. Offering real conversations and developed using accurate fluent speakers to ensure authenticity and proper accent formation means that this is like getting professional lessons but at a fraction of the price. You get access to daily lessons, and at the end of each week and month, you get a quiz that recaps what you've learned. If you're interested in learning a new language, then feel free to click the link in the description for 65% off a lifetime purchase of Mondly. No subscription required. And thank you to Mondly for sponsoring this video. The Rook alone breaks tradition for Far Cry, which is that they are a blank slate. Not even their gender is confirmed. I believe this is done intentionally because with this game taking place in the United States, a place that much of the West is intimately familiar with, it would be more important to give the player a character they can identify with. Customization rarely hurts a game, and when so much of Far Cry's themes as a series surround critiquing the person holding the controller, blurring the line further by making the player avatar a direct reflection of the player enhances those critiques. This will be important especially in this story, as the seeds attempt to get into the player's mind, converting them to a loyal servant of Eden's Gate. Immediately as we arrive, we can see the cult lives on their own terms. They're dirty, aggressive, and uniform in their rough edges. Inside the church stands the Four Horsemen, the Seed family. Its head, Joseph Seed, halts the sermon and offers himself up for arrest, holding faith that God won't let you take him. Far Cry 4's alternate ending began a trend that continues here, as we can choose to not arrest Joseph and walk away. This is the closest we will get to a good ending. If we instead choose to arrest Joseph, Eden's Gate will riot. Their devotion is on full display, and one even sacrifices himself to the blade of a helicopter, causing it to crash, all to allow Joseph to escape. Joseph declares that the collapse has begun, and with it, the cultists begin what seems like an operation to fully take over Hope County, in preparation for the end. The crew is split up in the chaos, and we nearly escape, but are driven off a bridge into the waters below, saved by a local named Dutch. Dutch houses us in an underground bunker, a site that will become familiar as most of Hope County are doomsday preppers, often owning underground bunkers in preparation for a nuclear war. Dutch's Island is where the game's tutorial takes place, and showcases early how different this game will be from previous games. The first is our motivations. Jason wanted to save his friends, Ajay wanted to find Lakshmana, and taking down whatever oppressive force that ruled over the island was secondary to their goal. Liberating Karat was never the goal, it was a means to an end. In Hope County, the goal is to take Joseph down and free the people. There is only one detail we know about the character, and that is their position as a deputy, meaning their goal is inherently in upholding the law, and, under a hopeful assumption, are there to uphold the greater good. We spend most of our time here looking at how to dismantle the cult's hold on Hope County. We can destroy their structures, liberate their outposts, and free their prisoners. Now, instead of liberating outposts and climbing radio towers being seen as side content or essential to expanding our safety net, it's tied to the main quest. I think this change works well for a few reasons. The first and largest is that it avoids dissonance. In Far Cry 4, you could destroy Pagan and yet his outposts could remain. His men would still occupy most of Karat if you didn't clear those outposts. The second reason this is a good change is because it aids progression and balance, which we can speak more on later. Our final task is to climb and reactivate a radio tower, and it's done by simply climbing a ladder, and Dutch tells us this.
I ain't gonna have you climbing towers all over the county for me, so don't worry.
This is a significant statement to make, because it's Ubisoft saying that they will strip back a core part of the series' gameplay loop, but it's a necessary change and one that benefits the land. As foreigners in Karat, Oros, Rook Islands, we don't know the land, what it contains, and what the culture might be. I don't know about you, but despite not living in the United States, the scenery is by no means foreign. I don't need to survey the land. I know what I'm getting into. What this also benefits is exploration. When a radio tower was fixed in previous games, it would showcase surrounding landmarks, and this supplemented a problem with the world design, which was a lack of intrigue in the world. When the land has nothing to beckon players to look closer, they won't, and so radio towers are no longer needed because Hope County has more to see and was an inherently more interesting place. This isn't due to the setting itself, but due to the world design, which had more signifiers such as smokestacks that indicate actions over the horizon, conflicts in the streets that always made you slow down, or even a precarious looking home. I think not being actively shown the landmarks, not artificially surveying the area in Hope County before diving in, made the world feel larger and deeper than previous entries. Once Dutch's Island is secure, we get a formal introduction to the cult and our three antagonists. John Seed is the head of recruitment, the first step in the cult's production, finding susceptible people and cleansing them of their sins. If they survive, they move on to the next step, Faith Seed. Faith controls and distributes a psychedelic drug known as Bliss, using her mastery over it to manipulate anyone caught within it. Due to the drug's permeance throughout her region of the Henbane River, people can constantly be seen wandering, absorbed in the bliss, and ready to be commanded by Faith. Some never recover, as the drug has the ability to scramble one's mind, and thus they move on to the final step, which is Jacob's Seed, the eugenic militant who focuses on taking the best of Hope County and breaking them down. If they can be built back up, they become part of his army, and if they can't, they are called. You are free to tackle the different regions as you see fit, but you are heavily encouraged to begin with John, and outside of a cutscene more or less holding a neon sign in the direction of Holland Valley, it makes the most narrative sense. There has been plenty of debate around which route is the canon route, though we have no confirmation. Initially, I chose to tackle Jacob, Faith, and John, but this resulted in an unfulfilling story. I now believe the most appropriate route is John, Faith, and Jacob. I'll explain why as the evidence becomes relevant, but we can begin our journey through Hope County by heading towards Holland Valley, as it seems our fellow deputy, Joey Hudson, has been captured by John, and we can get help by heading to a little town called Falls End. John Seed controls the wealth and legal troubles of Hope County, and is exactly how the cult was able to acquire their funding for guns, bunkers, and land. A normal question asked after the opening is how can the cult have acquired so much without the law getting involved until now? And the answer is that they did so by exploiting the legal system. Following this trend with legality is John's main role for Rook and the cult, which is to cleanse recruits, forcing them through torture to confess their sins before him. Many of our interactions with him feature us being judged, drawing immediate parallels to the judgment of the law. John's region must be completed first because it sets up the logistics of the cult and offers the most accurate portrayal of how a cult rises to prominence. Holland Valley is relatively ordinary. Whereas other regions see us destroying drug shrines and wolf dens, this area asks only that we destroy silos. It represents the small-scale nature of this region, and it allows us to focus entirely on just toppling someone's empire with different weapons. We free the people of Falls End and find that a priest and bar owner are among the quest givers that reside here. Priest Jerome is an important character to note because he is overtly Christian, and overtly one of the good guys. Something John's region makes clear too is that religion is not the subject of critique in this game, it's cults, and it's an exploration of how the cults rise and where a situation like this may lead. It's not Christianity that is the problem, it's the people exploiting Christianity. Religion and cults go hand in hand because there is a critical mental hurdle that one needs to overcome before they are indoctrinated into a cult, and it all comes down to faith. I am not comparing Christianity to a cult. I was raised Christian, and while I don't practice it, I haven't been to church in a decade, I still do believe in the religion to an extent. What I'm saying is that in order to be a fully devout Christian, you need to be able to look past certain holes. God is good, but God's creations, humans, cause harm every day. Even he himself flooded the fucking earth because he was pissed off. We have no proof of God and simply need to hold faith that those who tell stories of their encounters with God are telling the truth. This makes us primed for exploitation by a cult because we too have to put our faith in a figure like Joseph without solid proof, and by way of our faith, turn our heads when we see a holy man like him or John causing harm. None of the seeds are holy or good, but they have convinced themselves and others through their delusions that not only is God supportive of their actions, but is in some ways dictating them. This is part of their shtick too, something they acknowledge, as John states multiple times that everyone has sin within them. But so do we, and after helping some of the people in Holland Valley, we have a search party sent to capture us. We wake to John attempting a baptism, encouraging us to admit our sins, bring them out, so that they may be cleansed. But there's a problem here. John enjoys this process a little too much. Had it not been for Joseph, we likely would have ended up dead. Now, this could also be that if we follow the cult's production line, someone who can't even get past John surely would be called by Jacob. Whatever region you tackle first, in our case John's, will be the one to introduce the larger gameplay loop to you. You arrive at different towns, interact with the locals, often doing menial tasks, until the herald who controls the region gets annoyed enough with you to come down and lay down the law. On paper, this is repetitive, and maybe the unimmersed would agree, but when fully immersing yourself, it becomes much more dynamic, especially as it solves a common problem with Far Cry villains, which is their lack of screen presence. Far Cry has never struggled to make a compelling antagonist, but actually showing them is another story. I've wondered before if the reason these villains were never shown much is because Ubisoft simply doesn't have enough material for them, and it's better to have their presence be short and sweet. Well, Joseph and his family prove that wrong in some great ways. The most obvious is Joseph's presence in the Herald's regions. It's not always making an actual appearance, but the feeling that he's watching over you. People are always talking about him, his most loyal followers have the upper hand on you, and the presence of God somehow feels akin to the presence of Joseph. Whether God speaks to him or not, it can't be ignored that he survived a fatal helicopter crash virtually unscathed, and we'll see sooner that he's the only character to win. Maybe God does favor him. The biggest theme in Holland Valley is the phrase, yes. It's not even hidden, this is just a commentary on obedience in a cult, and how the cult leaders want you to just say yes. We, however, say no in the only way we can, but sometimes the ways in which we say no aren't all that fun. There were 2 missions I remembered after my playthrough: the Widowmaker, which sees you piloting a truck with guns to the soundtrack of Heart's Barracuda, and the missions you do for Nick Rye, which is a highlight because it's the first time in the series we get to fly a plane, but otherwise, the people you meet often lacked memorability, even the ones that are supposed to be important. The inhabitants of Hope County can be split into 3 categories: main characters, side characters, and NPCs, all offering something different. Main characters are self-explanatory and will offer story missions. Despite the name, story missions don't need to be completed in order to free a region, but their tasks are categorized as such because they often directly link to the plot and allow the player to learn or do something significant within the region to the point where we would consider it canon. Side characters are often available as guns for hire, and they will help you in battle. I never use these characters because they felt antithetical to the plot and vibe I love about all the Far Cry games, which is the deeply personal journey of a lone wolf resisting an oppressive force and becoming a monster along the way. The quests that actually unlock said guns for hire are usually rather short and uninteresting, with the only standout character being Jess due to the lore the game sets up around a character named the Cook. But even then, I never used her. Cheeseburger is cool though, and feels very American. Most regular NPCs offer more utility than they ever have, and they can now tell you about nearby activities like outposts, prepper stashes, or simply people you could go meet. It's another reason removing radio towers feels right, because for as much as I praised it, this game is postured as a community-driven pushback, one where you and the rest of the town resist, not just you. Instead of surveying the area yourself, you rely on the locals to point you in the right direction. It blurs the line between the people and the land, making them feel more like people who actually live there instead of people just plopped on the map. I love this change, and it didn't take away from the fun of discovering things on my own either. I think one of Far Cry 5's biggest strengths is that its progression is mostly left up to the player. You'll need to dip your toes in every facet at least once, but sticking purely to outposts to dismantle Eden's Gate is just as valid as helping the locals directly or simply flying around looking for things to blow up. Perhaps for better or worse, it reminded me a lot of Just Cause 3, where it felt as though no problem couldn't be solved by making a small pit stop to blow something up. One of the greatest strengths with this game is how well gameplay and narrative mesh with each other. Think about the previous games. Pagan Min would rule over the entire island regardless of how many outposts you liberated. This resulted in dissonance if you did them all right away because Pagan was still in power, and if you left them all for last, then Pagan's departure meant nothing because his people still patrolled the streets. His fortresses were still guarded. With Far Cry 5, since everything we do results in some kind of resistance, and since our antagonist is a cult, it makes sense that they hang around and still try to regroup after their leader is defeated. Further, our goal isn't entirely to topple the cult, it's to piss off the Heralds enough to force a confrontation. These are strong points of Hope County, however, the weak points are unfortunately the things in between. Perhaps I'm being too harsh on the game, but I rarely found myself caring about the inhabitants and often saw them as a means to an end. If we think about the guns for hire, the problem is clear. They all do the same thing. Sure, a dog or bear that helps is great, but otherwise, it's just a military person or a hunter person. I never encountered Herc in the game. I know you guys give me shit about it all the time, but I fucking hate that guy. And now typically, the missions you complete will contribute to a larger plan, but that isn't the case in John's region. And this, surprisingly, is another reason I believe it should be completed first. John's is the only region where you aren't directly stalked, manipulated, or hunted, and so much of your actions are offensive, whereas later, you are on the defense just as much. John is also the weakest villain, so completing his region leaves us with a scaling conflict and quality. Okay, let's stop beating around the bush and start saying no. At first, this results in a baptism, a successful one at that, and one that aims to critique the player as previous games have. Bit of a problem, that critique isn't very insightful because it's the third time we're seeing it. It's like making an hour-long plot summary and posturing it as insightful analysis. Anywho, it's not like that critique isn't valid. We've spent the last few minutes, as Pagan would put it, blowing shit up. But the difference here is that the critique doesn't position the player as bloodlusty animals, instead arguing that their senseless killing is actually something to be exploited by their enemies. We're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, I want to point out an interesting mechanic where you become hunted by the Herald squad. In most regions, you are hit by a random arrow that knocks you out. When I say random, I mean it. But in John's region only, you can avoid capture for as long as you can defeat the enemies coming after you. I'm not sure why they didn't bother with this for the other regions, as it means that if I was skilled enough, I could have a bit more time to prepare. Once captured again, we'll see the torture firsthand, and it leaves Joey a mess. John explains that his parents introduced him to the power of yes, and we can infer that the reason he acts the way he does is because he was abused by his parents, and now does the same thing to the cult. We can choose to offer ourselves as the first to be cleansed, but if we do nothing, John lashes out and decides to start with us anyways. This is what indicated to me that he isn't preaching the power of yes because he believes it, but because he desires obedience, control, and likely from a childhood that didn't have any. We escape our chamber, which is revealed to be in an abandoned bunker. And at this point, John is sending everything at us. This is one area where the gameplay clashes with the story. It's clear that all of the heralds are following Joseph's word, and believe that you can be saved. Your mind can be changed. You don't need to be killed. But when John is sending literal planes out to patrol the streets and hunt you down, it feels like the game isn't going all the way with this. It's a hard thing to address though, because what's the alternative? We don't have enemies? After causing some more destruction, we can create a confrontation with John that takes place in the air, and offers another way I felt rewarded for doing things my way. Once I shot John's plane down, the interaction is supposed to go something like John running away and we confront him at his bunker. But instead, I was able to ram into him as he parachuted down. At first, the game didn't allow this, but a second attempt proved fruitful, and resulted in one of the most memorable moments, because not only was I defying John, refusing his offers, but I was denying the game's script, making it say yes to me. John's final words acknowledge the doubt players begin with. Look, even if Joseph did appear to be under God's watch at the beginning, surely that is just a coincidence or even a narrative tool to make him more formidable. John directly asks us, what if Joseph is right? What I found most notable about this interaction is the idea of God isn't mentioned. Instead, John points to the world leaders, the headlines, and the world itself. He knows we've seen it. Hell, an entire side quest revolves around looting people's bunkers, and those bunkers don't become so abundant without reasonable cause. He says that the people are safe being hidden in those bunkers, and that we're putting them in danger by kicking them out. And it's reasonable to wonder then, if maybe John has a point. Allow me to sound crazy for a moment, but let's try and entertain Joseph's plan in the most charitable way. Let's say he really was trying to recruit people to Eden's Gate as a means of surviving the collapse or otherwise nukes. Maybe this brainwashing, baptizing, and general cult activities is his way of making a united people that will be able to rebuild the world in harmony. When the world is reborn, Joseph will be the leader of that world. So if he really wanted to keep as many people safe, not just through the collapse, but through the rebuilding of society, he would need people to follow his words. Now, this is a hard pill to swallow, given that he is torturing, killing, and brainwashing people in order to get this done, and the effects of his new drug are not yet seen for both humans and nature as a whole, so it's still hard to sympathize with the Peggies, as locals call them, but this moment of reflection, I believe, was meant to enact the typical Far Cry self-examination of who is the bad guy, who is the good guy, and is there a difference? And that sums up Holland Valley rather well. The Book of John is more or less standard Far Cry. I think this is why the game pushes you in its direction. As mentioned, quite a few parts of the Far Cry formula have been changed with this game, so it's important that there is as much familiarity in those opening hours as possible, to ensure players don't think the product is straying too far. Henbane River and the Whitetail Mountains both offer experiences that feel less like the player is in control, something foreign to a series that has always had a core of exerting power at the cost of everything else. It ends with us rescuing Joey, who is more or less never seen again, and we're free to either tie up loose ends or continue forth to the next region. I didn't bother with too much sidetracking during my exploits, as I often save them for the post-game, game, but there was one mission I went out of my way for, and it was because Nick Rye's wife, Kim, was going into labor. This was a short and sweet mission that nailed something the Far Cry games have typically struggled with when it came to side content, and that's creating small, engaging memories. This interaction, all the way from Kim screaming bloody murder in the backseat to us being named the Godfather, did more to humanize the people of Hope County than any other mission in the game. It was a grim reminder that the people here have lives that move forward in spite of Eden's Gate. That's part of how a group like this can grow so much. People have other worries, and it's never really more important than, for example, a newborn, until it boils over and they start hunting people down. I wish there were more human moments like this, because they serve as some much needed downtime between the action and dark humor, but we'll see that in the game's other regions, we lean more into the fantastical, and not in a mythical way, but in a comical way. Faith is a fickle thing. It's something so difficult to gain and so easy to lose, and yet the people of Eden's Gate have the utmost faith in Joseph's seed. Faith and hope are ideas cut from the same cloth. The difference is belief. You can hope something is going to happen, or hope that it doesn't, but faith dictates what you believe. What faith can also do is blind you. People who believe in fate, for example, could have faith that whatever is happening to them, either good or bad, is part of God's plan. This faith in God's plan for the seeds is exactly why you haven't been killed yet, a question that rears its head more and more with each herald killed. Every herald, especially Faith and Jacob, have the ability to more or less summon you at any point against your will. If they wanted you dead, why didn't they kill you? It's inferred that Joseph either tells them not to, or that they don't feel it's necessary. For Jacob, it's an easy justification. You're more useful alive. But Faith, as the name would imply, simply has faith that you can be turned around, converted into a loyal soldier for Eden's Gate. The Henbane River is a naturally ethereal place. Gone are the commercial areas of Fall's End, and in are the outback cabins and long fields of people singing songs, praising the Father, and dancing in the bliss. Faith stalks you through nature, often embodying animals or projecting herself to you. The bliss embodies a specific point for the cult, which is to prove the existence of angels, God, and the ethereal. Faith has wings of an angel. She speaks not through radio or speakers, but directly to you, as if projecting her voice directly into your mind. By all legitimate means, her mastery of the bliss makes her a goddess. This theme creates a fun dynamic where, despite us growing in power significantly, we're often left powerless here. Once defeating John, you'll notice that the game gets a bit harder. Far Cry 5 has a great system where outposts will level up their security based on how many heralds you have killed. This solves the progression issue on the side of the challenge not changing. But what about the other side of the progression issue? You'll remember that I mentioned a problem in Far Cry 4 and 3, which is that the moment you get a gun with a silencer on it, the game is won. The same is true here. Sure, the bow is an option, and once you get used to its physics, it's one of the best weapons in the game, but a silenced rifle turns this first-person action game into a point-and-click adventure. The solution is a simple one: make it less accessible. With this kind of progression, we can funnel the players into the essential early game Far Cry experience. You're made of glass, are scrounging around for what tools you can, and moving through that constant chaos instills a sense of danger, which is critical for making the mid and late game one that feels earned. You know the dirt, so soaring above it feels so much more euphoric. But if this is my 5th time going through that cycle, then surely it's not right to force me back to the dirt when I don't want to be there, right? Well, the answer is also simple. Put suppressors and weapons that can equip them behind money, and make money difficult to come by. Liberating an outpost will give you 400, and it costs 900 to buy a suppressor alone. This means most players won't have their first proper suppressed weapon until at least defeating one herald, but you can get it early if you show a mastery of the systems. If you complete an outpost without alarms going off, then the reward is $600, and if you're not detected at all, then the reward is 1,000. Remember, during the early game, silent takedowns are only possible with melee or a bow, so it's hardest to do these requirements in the early game, but if you do, then you can speed up the progression. Now, granted, you can also buy premium currency to unlock these items early, but I'd rather superglue my foreskin to a moving vehicle, so that's not really part of the equation for me. The outposts themselves are much better than previous entries, and a lot of that has to do with the layout. I never spoke about layout much in previous entries because they were always just fine, but here, it was noticeably good. What makes them good is that they offer a puzzle to be solved. There wasn't wasn't usually just one way to approach a base, and while most of them could be solved by dropping literal bombs on the place and leveling it, stealth and even guns blazing wise, there were plenty of tools to try. Maybe there's a turret nearby that can be used, or an animal that can be released to cause chaos. Companions are never great at stealth, so I often went solo, but it's good fun in co-op. Checkpoints aren't often the best, meaning that if I got spotted and restarted, I'd be much farther than I'd like, but in co-op, the checkpoints were much tighter, meaning it was less annoying for my partner when I fumbled time and time again. Difficulty-wise, especially by the endgame, I found Far Cry 5 to be hands down the most challenging so far. This is because enemies can spot you better, but not without reason, and they react to the environment in better ways. Sometimes they will hear a shot if you use a particularly loud sniper, suppressor be damned. If a body slumps in an unlucky way and falls in front of an enemy, the whole base will be on alert, and in some cases, they will pull the alarm at the first sign of trouble. This not only made the outpost more challenging, but it made my character feel as though they had a reputation. This wasn't simply a response to my player progression, it was a response to the deputy. Eventually, it's common to hear people praise you for your exploits, even when you haven't met them, and the outpost being this anxious of you makes me feel like my legend is growing, where other games would be content to just tell you. This added complexity is why the lower number of outposts in this game is not something I hold against it. They were always proper tasks, not menial side activities I did on the way to the main quest. But I guess the reason it's much better here is because, for all intents and purposes, it is the main quest. A large problem that arises in Faith's region is that the story quests, as the game labels them, often aren't progressing the story very much, and instead offer to entrench you in the world, which is ultimately what the story surrounds. For example, when we head to the Hope County Jail to meet up with the Marshal, we meet the different characters that help him. We see how they are defending themselves against Faith, but we don't know anything about him. We learn about Faith, about Joseph, but our friends are only ever postured as friends, but are never treated as such. There's an interesting twist at the end of the game where Joseph brainwashes all of your friends with bliss, but what makes this moment fall flat is that we never get fully acquainted with any of them beyond immediate sympathy. Pastor Jerome is a cool character, but I don't know anything about him. And by that point in the playthrough, I hadn't seen him in over 10 hours. I bring this issue up now because it's most obvious here. Our journey in this region is with Faith and no one else, which means these story missions, which have no impact on the rest of the game, are just stepping stones to get to our next encounter with the Herald. It's striking how similar the structure of this game is to Assassin's Creed Origins, another game that needed to overhaul a repetitive series, and did so by blurring the line between side quest and main quest, by introducing level gating. This resulted in players doing more side quests than main quests to hit an arbitrary number. Far Cry 5 has the same outcome, but instead, it's presented as liberating the land. If we look at the two games as paths, it's clear that Ubisoft would be wise to not follow Assassin's Creed's footsteps towards a more RPG-focused series. Thank God they didn't turn Far Cry 5 into some bullshit RPG, am I right, guys? Hey guys, why aren't you laughing? Not having any real structure works well sometimes. One of the first things I passed once entering the region was a large statue of the Father, and I was told by Dutch that I might want to tear it down, so I did. The whole thing came crumbling, and not only did I leave a lasting impact on the world, seeing as the statue is now permanently removed, but I also learned more about Joseph and progressed the story. These are the moments where progression feels without friction, but then we come to a problem that is most noticeable in Faith's region, and that's the grind. I use the word grind rather loosely because it's not exactly a grind in the way that you need to collect 100 rocks or something, but rather you'll reach a point where you have exhausted leads and don't have enough reputation to force Faith's hand. This led to moments where I was wandering aimlessly looking for quests, and while there is more than enough here, the problem I ran into is that I lost some of the freedom that made the game so fun. In Holland Valley, I didn't care much for Nick Rye, so I didn't do his quests, and instead progressed the game doing the things I liked. When you were given Slim Pickens in Henbane River, I was forcing myself to do quests I didn't find good. Collecting a new paw for hire Peaches was a tedious mission that saw us throwing endless bait in order to bring her back home. Then, for no reason other than her owner being annoyed, she is entrusted to us. This is one of many moments where Far Cry 5 attempts to be funny, and most times it sticks the landing, but with any game that has humor at its forefront, you're bound to miss from time to time. Fortunately, the need to explore this region more will encourage players to find better means of traversal, like the wingsuit. I've had many conversations so far in this series retrospective all about the significance of the wingsuit, and how it shouldn't be granted to players early. However, in this game, it's given to players at, mostly, the perfect time. You can unlock it through upgrading the perk skills. If you really wanted it, you could acquire the wingsuit after only an hour or two, but then you'd forego some borderline essential skills like heavy takedowns, more weapon holsters, ulcers, and perhaps most important of all, more health. Far Cry 5 has one of the most difficult early games, and I found myself feeling like I was made of glass often, so the wingsuit didn't come around until a bit later. It's also worth noting that the phase of soaring above a land you once explored is different here because, if you are living in the West, then this land isn't new to you. The way you earn perk points is not through leveling up, but by completing challenges. This is the ideal system for a game like this because it means you can always be working through a challenge as a secondary objective, and it encourages players to not use the same weapon for the whole game. In the words of Soren Johnson, given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. Further optimizations will come from acquiring more skills, so acquiring perk points, which can be done by using different weapons and tools, becomes the path to optimization, and if we make the journey to that optimization fun, then you've undoubtedly created a fun game. I think this is why people like the gameplay of Far Cry 5 so much. It encourages the chaos that makes the series so fun, and discourages the safe route. This is where Faith's region rests thematically for the Rook. We're past the point of just trying to survive, and are now trying to improve, meet more allies, and refine our skills. Faith has other plans, and before we can get too far ahead, we get a message that we have been blessed, and before much else, we're pulled into the bliss. Bliss is a drug, but the bliss also applies to the state of mind. Not just the drugs, but the morals of the cult. Faith specifically makes the argument that Eden's Gate is doing good because their amazing grace saved a wretch like her. Addicted to cocaine and wandering the streets, Joseph took Faith in, and now, not only does she serve as a symbol of how Christ can turn your life around, but she is the cult's kindness. The elite enemies Faith employs are people who have had their minds permanently scrambled by the bliss, and from the outside, that doesn't seem so bad. Faith is the most interesting villain because she is the only one whose heart seems to be in the right place. John takes too much pleasure in punishing sinners, and Jacob seems only motivated by his own eugenic ideals. Faith genuinely believes in Joseph's cause, and wants you to believe as well. Often our encounters with her aren't violent, they are conversations. Maybe Eden's Gate isn't so bad. Maybe we are the bad guys. But no, if we zoom out, we see Joseph's most innocent victim. Joseph took an addict and got her hooked on something else, and then convinced her through the drug trips that would show her visions only a deity could that Joseph truly was a prophet. Then, after developing the same control, she perpetuates the same lie, presenting herself as an angel. When she asks you to take a leap of faith, we see at the bottom that many didn't survive, and that could all be chalked up to those people not believing. I don't mean to say Faith is entirely innocent, but just the most innocent, because she is the only one who doesn't question Joseph. Her region also calls into question if the bliss is worth staying in. At risk of sounding too charitable, if someone is eternally happy in their reality, even if that reality is fake, are those feelings still invalid? A visceral response is no, because life without hardship isn't worth living, or that you'd rather be in a real world with flaws than a perfect one that is smoke and mirrors. But is that really true? I play games that I find perfect or idyllic all the time, and yet, despite knowing they are lines of code, a series of magic tricks, I spend time in them, knowing it isn't real because it makes me happy. If I enter the bliss and am in a constant state of euphoria, then why wouldn't I want to stay, even if it does fry my head? To go back to the gaming example, I know my eyes get strained when I stay up late, 32 inches of LEDs bathing my face, and that's not good for me, but who cares? I'm happy. A fascinating anecdote I heard from a lifelong heroin user is that the thing that makes it so addictive is that it really is the greatest feeling ever, and once you feel it, you'll never be satisfied with anything else. It's part of why rehabilitation is so difficult, because you have to actively choose to be more or less bored all the time. With this mindset, I can see where Faith is coming from. The world is such a bleak place and no one person could change it, and those with the money to do so benefit too much from its flaws to bother. So why not escape, and if the worst case comes, you'll die in pure bliss. While I don't think Faith would be correct for thinking this, it is a mindset I can sympathize with, especially when you come from a background like hers. Faith continually is angered by our actions, especially as we try to rescue the Marshal, who seems happy within the bliss. This exposes a metaphor of the bliss, which is how most cults operate on your loved ones. When we see someone sucked into a cult, they engage in destructive behavior, often cutting off most of their friends and family, sometimes changing their name, all for the sake of the Father. And outsiders are posed a legitimate question. Do you stop them? You may want what's best for them, and sure, you might believe their actions to be wrong or misguided, but they appear happy, they appear as if they want to be there, and they consciously choose to remain. You have no more right to exert your will over that person than Eden's Gate does. Look at the Marshal. He's to some degree at peace. How could we take that away from him? Regardless, we do take that away from him, but the problem with my theory that we run into is that it is indeed revealed that Faith can control people with the bliss, and she asks the Marshal to kill a man named Virgil, and then himself. This eliminates a lot of the nuance that our interactions with Faith could have, as it poses not just Faith as an undisputed bad guy, but the bliss as an undisputed weapon of said bad guys. There is a common criticism with Far Cry 5 that it's afraid to say too much, and perhaps this is one of those moments. Maybe I'm looking too far into it. After all, every member of the Seed family is guilty of wrath once pushed far enough, and Faith does come off as more vindictive, as though she's getting revenge. She then, however, takes the sheriff. Our final encounter with Faith is within the bliss entirely. She uses her powers to shoot projectiles at us, summons enemies, and creates copies of herself. It's basic, especially given the firepower you have by now, but it was still thematically quite fun. Faith's last words signal one of the most ominous, vague messages in the game, which is that we, the Rook, play a larger role in this than anyone else, and that perhaps, in some twisted way, this, our arrival and resistance, is part of the plan, God's plan. Her words saying that depending on what we choose, he will be right, echoed throughout my playthrough, and so did her words of walking the path. You can walk the path she speaks of, and it lays out the origins of Joseph and how he had to cleanse himself, and how God called him to Hope County. It also tells us that Joseph foretold the collapse by the arrival of a white horse. To connect this to the Book of Revelations, a figure sometimes interpreted as either the Antichrist or Christ himself rides a white horse. We, the Rook, ride into Hope County alongside the Sheriff White Horse. I believe this parallel to Revelations is intentional because if we assume us to be the figure accompanied by the White Horse, then it is up for debate if we are here as a destructive force or as a divine one, to spread the gospel of Eden's Gate. Once dealing with Faith, we can shut down her bunker and rescue our White Horse, as he is in the clutches of Faith's influence. Once we shut down the production of bliss, another seal is opened. In order to make sure we beat the 15 minutes of antagonist allegations, after the death of each herald, Joseph will upload a video about their death, and get progressively angrier too. We've now destroyed 2/3 of his family, his youngest brother, his sister, and all that is left is Jacob, the militant herder, looking to call the herd in much more effective ways than the past heralds. As we move to the Whitetail Mountains, we leave behind a land that is unchanged by Faith's death. There's a continual feeling that she never really did die. We never saw her get thrown through a wood chipper, so by media standards she might as well still be living it up in Cancun, but her impact, the bliss's impact, is still felt all over the land. Henbane River has some of the most beautiful sights in Hope County, mesmerizing, like a drug. Even without her bliss, there is still tranquility here, and if the sights are a drug, then the UI is fucking Narcan. Half the time when driving, we're forced to see the controls for a vehicle for most of that drive, taking too long before it eventually goes away on its own. I understand why this is done. We can't expect players to memorize the controls instantly, and so to help them bear the mental load, we leave some of the memory in the world, manifested in a simple list saying, this button does that. The problem is that it compromises the view and it doesn't need to. We can have this overlay when we first enter any vehicle, but after that, have only a small reminder in the corner that says press X button to show controls. That way we can still leave that knowledge in the world and not block the view. When you run out of rockets in a helicopter, you are not punished by having no ammo, you are punished by having permanent text overlaid on your view asking that you pay an outrageous $1,000 to refill said ammo. I nearly did it a few times just to make the prompt disappear. I may be harping on a minor detail, but I think even small design decisions like this can have major ramifications for the rest of the game as a piece of art. It's a reminder that this is a game to be played and not one to be experienced. I could rarely find myself truly entranced in Hope County because of this UI, and because it lacked a better alternative, it meant that I didn't want to turn it off entirely. This became most frustrating during the end of the game. As I approached the Whitetail Mountains for the first time, at this point a master of the world, I found myself still being treated as a novice. Jacob's region functions like many other third acts of a Far Cry game, where the personal progression is complete, and we have a series of missions designed entirely around simply perfecting our killing. At this point, we can't go back, because we're in too deep. We are the only ones capable of taking down Joseph's operation, and that isn't just inferred, it's told. Practically everyone in Hope County vocalizes how you are the only one who can do this. Only you can stop Joseph. Only you can take back the county. Only you can... Only... Jacob's region needs to be completed last because its message is at its most potent when you have begun mastering the lands of Hope County and are not concerned with unlocking new skills, weapons, or tools, but becoming more efficient with them. The outposts will be harder than they have ever been, with difficult layouts, reinforcements are a death sentence, and you'll no longer be able to fumble through an encounter. You need precision, efficiency, and a killer instinct, and that's exactly what Jacob wants. What also makes this region necessary to complete last is that a major theme is how the game brainwashes you, and this is most plausible from a gameplay and narrative perspective when we have hours of mindless killing and a whole region-long drug trip behind us. The Book of Jacob on the surface asks if you are the bad guy, but that's a simple interpretation. I believe Jacob's region is about taking advantage of the player's instincts to kill without asking, and appeal to their desires for improvement. Earlier Far Cry games saw your growing efficiency in taking life as a product of strength and power, but Jacob sees weakness in that power, something to be exploited. This all starts with your first encounter with Jacob, which sees you being brainwashed and put through a series of trials. Notably, the enemies you are killing here are not the typical Peggies we have been slaughtering throughout the game, and instead look a little like locals. I didn't notice this appropriately on my first playthrough. The words train, only you, and pictures of wolves are painted over the walls, and once complete, we wake up to see that we were the only survivors. We're rescued by some resistance members, but some in their secret bunker aren't so willing to accept us, claiming they know what that room does to people. Ethan and the player naturally assume, nah, we're built different. We can handle it, and we'll come to find out that isn't exactly true. Jacob's region, as far as resistance goes, is all about dismantling his brainwashing operation, which inadvertently exposes us to that very subliminal messaging. Because there is so much combat, it exposes the problems with shooting, which is, surprisingly, not much at all. Recoil is realistic, everything feels accurate, and the gun sounds are great. Most set pieces that do see you fighting an overwhelming force feature some kind of explosive or mounted gun for you to take advantage of, and while I prefer to go more in depth, if you have seen my Far Cry 3 and 4 videos, then you know the shooting is largely unchanged and instead improved. My biggest gripe with combat is that I think you won't have quite enough health, and this was likely due to Far Cry's attempts at balancing, which we have seen different aspects of so far. Part of what makes Far Cry easy is that you could infinitely regenerate your health. Medkits and syringes could make that healing process faster, but at its core, finding cover for a moment to regenerate was everyone's strategy to win. So here, they removed it. And look, I think being able to infinitely heal is a big part of Far Cry's identity because it represents the savagery you feel when you're injured and decide to more or less say fuck it and keep fighting. Picking a bullet out of your arm tells you more about the lethality of your gunfight than a brittle health bar. While removing the infinite healing is fine, it sacrifices a bit of the series' identity. Is that sacrifice worth it? Hard to say. What matters is that it results in a more consistent experience, difficulty-wise, which is important. Of course, difficulty needs to be considered when factoring in co-op mode. Far Cry 5 is the first Far Cry to have the entire campaign playable in drop-in and drop-out co-op. I want to state right away that I think this is awesome and should continue to be a staple in the series going forward because when replaying the game with friends, it really is a great way to experience the game. But oh my god, does it ruin the experience. Perhaps this is a me problem, and I'll accept that, but in my case, whenever I have played this game co-op, so much of the game is missed because of that extra person. The two rooks are never acknowledged, not that they need to be, and the game isn't designed for two people, so unless bumping up the difficulty, it will mostly be a cakewalk. But what playing this game in co-op really robbed me of was the holistic experience. Far Cry 5 isn't just its visuals, the gameplay, the story, it's all of that and some. And when you play with someone else, there is a rift that forms between you and the game. And in a game where the primary critique is you, that's a big problem. I no longer noticed how beautiful the world was because I was getting into janky shenanigans with my friend instead. I didn't appreciate the progression because the friend that joined already had a maxed out character. A great detail from Faith's region is that when in the bliss, the lyrics drowned by the divine chants will actually ask to be set free. This small detail entirely recontextualizes the bliss. Are those lyrics being directed at us? Does Faith secretly want to be set free? Is that our subconscious begging the conscious to escape? You know what it meant in co-op? Nothing, because I couldn't hear it. This isn't to say the game doesn't deserve co-op, but that it should be experienced in single player first, before you try co-op. I wondered if locking co-op to only New Game Plus would be a good idea, but that feels too restrictive and I don't have a better plan. After helping the people in the Whitetail Mountains a bit more, we're summoned again by Jacob and get a chance to speak to Joseph. Most of his speech boils down to the merit of sacrifice. Then, Jacob opens a music box, playing Only You, and we run through the trials again, and this time, Some extra rooms are near the end. Waking up once again in a pile of bodies and seemingly escaping from Jacob's grasp again, it becomes clear that Jacob's role in the cult is to create soldiers and serves as the final stop in the Peggy assembly line. John breaks people down, Faith destroys their grasp of reality, and Jacob builds them back up into hardened soldiers, ready to rebuild after the collapse. Calling the herd, as he calls it, is more or less eugenics, an accelerated natural selection, looking for the cream of the crop so that the new rulers of the world are all powerful. It's a flawed philosophy, but perhaps that flaw is what exposes the true plan. Jacob constantly hammers in the idea of only you, not just in an attempt to hypnotize, but to realize that we play a much larger role here. Perhaps this is why the Heralds have waited so long before trying to kill you. Hell, John was actively running away from you. Jacob's region is also the most cohesive, or at least, like Faith's, a lot more cohesive than John's. Everything you do centers around Jacob's goals and dismantling his brainwashing, which is important here because it means the player is always entrenched in the music, the killing, the calling. The region completes an arc in the game in regards to where people set themselves up. Holland Valley saw the people of Falls End standing their ground at their hometown. The Henbane River had those outside the Bliss fortifying themselves within the prison, and now in the Whitetail Mountains, we're seeing people stuck underground, actively hiding from Jacob. His presence is as omniscient as Faith's, but that isn't the point. Jacob wants to be elusive, he wants you to hate him, and more than anything, he wants to manipulate you. I've always said that the best games are the ones that make the player feel the same way the protagonist does, and this section of the game pulls it off perfectly with the music. I remember after completing an activity, I heard Only You playing, and I scrambled to find the nearest speaker, radio, whatever the hell was playing it, and I kept thinking, no, I'm not ready yet, leave me alone, and there was nothing that I could do to stop it. Next thing I knew, I was back under Jacob's control. Deputy Pratt is able to help us escape, but only barely, and that escape is short-lived given how quickly we are captured once again. By now, the trials we've been put through are presenting stricter time limits, and as we've spent most of the game shooting, we're becoming fast. The trials always end with us killing one last person, but this time, things look different. The soldiers we have been killing become more familiar, but nothing is out of place enough for us to notice. Even the environment itself looks familiar, but before long, we do what only we could have done, and Jacob taunts us. The following moments see us destroying the music and killing Jacob, but there's a stark difference between Jacob and the rest of the Seed family, which is that he is already won. Jacob reveals that he really doesn't know if his brother talks to God, but it doesn't matter. What does is that he was right, including about us. Joseph foretold our coming, and that our involvement was the push America needed to collapse in on itself like Rome and Babylon. This is a theme that Faith had mentioned too, that we, by arriving and resisting, are responsible for the world's events to follow. But the real reason Jacob wins here is that he did what no other seed could. Break us. He conditioned us to turn on our own. He turned us into a soldier fighting for the wrong side, and he completed the Seed's goals. John, Faith, and Jacob all had a part to play in our unraveling, in indoctrinating us and molding us into one of them. Jacob doesn't resist you once you've got him. He knows this is part of a grander plan, and that his sacrifice is integral. It fits his character given the lectures on sacrifice he has laid upon us thus far. Even if Jacob is gone now, his work remains. In a meta sense, this worked for the player too. I can't listen to the song Only You without thinking of Jacob. He found a way to get in our heads like no other seed could. The following video is of Joseph, now having a full meltdown because his family is gone. But it's clear that this was part of the plan, and I suppose that is what keeps him steadfast in his beliefs. Jacob, Faith, and John all accepted their deaths to some extent, and said that Joseph predicted it. They left this world with the confidence that this was part of the plan. Perhaps they were the sacrifices needed for God's plan, but by now, we don't know God's plan. There isn't much of a clue, but soon most of it will be explained. For now, we can look back on the Whitetail Mountains with the friends we made along the way who celebrate our victory. But ignore the elephant in the room. We killed Jacob, but we're still conditioned. And all it takes is for someone to play that song, and we'll be right back to square one. The Book of Jacob ends with a sentiment that we, the player, are fallible, not for any moral reasons, but because of conditioning. The region takes advantage of the games we played previously, and when the mirror is held up, we don't see the words monster scrawled on it, just the word idiot, because we continue to slaughter without thinking, running through trials like a trained killer, just because the game calls it liberation. The only significant issue with this critique is that we don't really have the choice, and those that question their objectives will in essence spoil that surprise early, but I'd like to think a lot of people don't question it. Regardless, with the final herald defeated, there's no one left but Joseph. A question permeates much of Far Cry 5. Does God actually talk to Joseph? Before we get to that, I want to mention that I think, at least within the Far Cry universe, God exists. In real life, my faith has been shaken one too many times by countless acts of violence, genocide, and corrupt officials that facilitate it, and there's the assumption that Far Cry mirrors the real world, but with one key difference: evidence. Faith in God within Far Cry is the same as real life. There is no evidence beyond the word of the Bible and anecdotes, except we, the player, know that intense supernatural encounters are not just real, but commonplace in the franchise. When a magic Tatau gives us borderline super strength, then it's not a massive stretch to say that something is above the clouds looking down on the world. So the real question is, does God speak to Joseph? And of course, the answer is incredibly ambiguous. Some believe that Joseph is just smart and in tune with the world around him. Given what we heard on the radio at times and given the amount of bunkers around the map, it's not a stretch to think that nuclear war could or would happen. However, Joseph did predict that it would happen when it did, and the truth is, it happened at the right time. And this is the crux of why I just can't accept that Joseph was in tune enough or smart enough to pull this off. Sure, he is smart, he is in tune, but think about all of the coincidences that occurred for him. When arrested, someone threw their head into a helicopter's blades. He could not have predicted that, and if he planned for someone to take the chopper down like that, severely risking his life, he's not as smart as we thought. Then he survives the chopper crash unharmed, whereas others died. Then, even further, he is able to escape before anyone else regains consciousness. Come on. No amount of smarts could do that. The better evidence for him being just a psychopath is the way he talks about God, often referring to them as the voice. We get bits and pieces of Joseph's backstory throughout the game, and by the time a complete story is compiled, it's far too late into the game. It goes as such. Joseph was a normal, religious man with a wife and a newborn daughter. Due to an accident, he lost his wife, and during his trauma, Joseph witnessed a vision from God, as well as hearing his voice telling him to prepare for the collapse. The first test God presented him was to sacrifice his child, and with that, he killed her. This immediately calls into question our theory that God really is speaking to Joseph. If God is assumedly good, then why would God encourage, even ask, for such violence? Why would he be complicit in the wars and the tragedies across the world, but Joseph is the exception? Now, just because God is likely real in Far Cry doesn't mean God is naturally good, but it just doesn't make sense. It's clear from the surrounding environment in Hope County that Christianity is mirrored to our real life. Thus, it could make sense that Joseph, after suffering a traumatic event, began experiencing hallucinations and thinking that God was talking to him. God, in this case, however, is Joseph's inner desires. He no longer wanted his daughter, so he killed her. He wanted to start a doomsday cult in the name of this God, but really, he just wanted power. He didn't allow John and Jacob to commit atrocities because God willed it. He did it because deep down he wanted it. He didn't find faith because God guided him, but because faith was vulnerable and ripe for manipulation. I said I believe that God truly was talking to Joseph, but there is a slight issue, and that is the Far Cry 6 DLC, Collapse, which, like the other expansions for Pagan Min and Voss, put us into the mind of the antagonist. However, I think Joseph is one of the few characters where he is damaged by an expansion like this. It's important to clarify that Joseph's strength isn't that he doesn't have enough screen time, because he does, but the strength is the uncertainty around if the voice is real and if the voice is just. This DLC either confirms that it isn't real, or if being charitable, that he knows what he is doing is wrong. And I think that kind of clarity makes Joseph a worse protagonist overall, especially when we take into account when this DLC takes place, which is right after the Resist ending, specifically after Joseph has been vindicated. The endings to Far Cry games have never been over the top, and realistically, they shouldn't be. It's a series that has always been about the journey, and in the end, the player never wins. If Pagan lives or dies doesn't matter, because Amita or Sabal will both become just as corrupt as him. Jason either dies at the hands of Citra or leaves the island going back to an old life that is terrified of the monster within him. So consider me shocked when people don't like that there is no happy ending here. Well, okay, that's not exactly the problem. The real issue is people feel these endings are unsatisfying, and in that way I can agree, but I can't say that it was a bad ending. When confronting Joseph, he reveals that he has brainwashed every single one of the deputy's friends. Now, really quick, this premise is immediately flawed, and I find this to be the most hard to believe part of the game, more unbelievable than the explosions to follow. Moving past that, we have a choice, the same one we were given at the beginning of the game, to either walk away or resist. To walk away means that you and your original crew get to leave Hope County, but before you can even hit the city limits, a familiar song plays over the radio.
What's wrong?
If you resist, you are engulfed in the bliss and engage in a frankly pretty lame boss fight against Joseph. We have to work to brainwash our friends by shooting and then reviving them, and once all are saved, we can defeat Joseph, but it just doesn't feel right. Joseph has been against fighting us for the entire game and is in complete control here. If he wanted to end things, he could have, and if he wanted to toy with us, then why? Oh, to buy time. Once Joseph is in cuffs, the unthinkable happens. Nukes begin dropping across Hope County, and the team does their best to drive away from the ensuing chaos. Some are screaming directions, others are screaming that it's the end, and Joseph is dead silent. Eventually you crash, and Joseph drags you into Dutch's bunker, where you and him will be trapped for the next 7 years. And finally, Joseph looks to the player and explains that all of this means one thing.
It means I was right.
This is exactly why I think Joseph Seed is one of the most interesting villains. All of this talk about whether God was talking to him or if he really was just smart or insanely lucky is only because, after all, he was right. Not just, but correct. And now, you are his slave. You lose. I absolutely love this ending, but I see the problems with it. It leaves the player with the impression that the series is going in a direction that is no longer grounded in the real world, and it also makes the journey, that aforementioned most important part, seem meaningless. There is this feeling that we really couldn't have stopped this. However, the branching timeline suggests something else. After Far Cry 5, we got Far Cry New Dawn, which continues the story of Joseph Seed and showcases what the world is like after the collapse. However, we then got Far Cry 6, which has no mentions of the collapse and looks seemingly normal. There are mentions of the project at Eden's Gate, however, the implication is that New Dawn is set in the timeline where the nukes go off, and 6 is in the timeline where the deputy walked away. The problem is that this means we did, in some way, have an impact on the ending. How we did this is hard to know, but it reframes a lot of the direct messages we received from the Heralds. All those moments where the Heralds made it seem as though we caused this, well, maybe we did. Maybe in Joseph's visions, he saw the exact events that would lead to the collapse and knew that we would be involved, and perhaps killing us wouldn't change things, so he needed to find a way to convert us. Maybe that's why he never challenged us. Ultimately, the strength of this ending lies not in if Joseph wins or loses, but in that through it all, he was right. Even if for the wrong reasons, and even if by sheer chance or divine intervention in spite of his sins, Joseph was right. This is what Far Cry 5 is about. It asks, what if one of those psychotic cult leaders was actually right in the end? What would that mean for the world? What would it mean for his victims and those that tried to stop him? Unfortunately, we don't get answers to all of those, but simply posing the question is sometimes enough to make us think. I think, despite what some may claim, the game can be very apolitical. It never calls religion into question, aside from those that are clearly using it for their own means, and it has little to say about the region that it takes place in, as many Far Crys do. Instead, it does what it's always done. It paints a picture of a region, a culture so well crafted that to a local, it feels like staring into a mirror. Perhaps the outrage isn't in the depiction, but in what stared back at them. From a gameplay standpoint, there is an argument to be made that Far Cry 5 was the beginning of the collapse of the franchise. No more radio towers, which were a welcome change, but the new progression and multiple antagonists led to certain innovations in Far Cry 6 and New Dawn that feel like broken bones. It wasn't clear how painful it was until we put more weight on it. In spite of this, core mechanics like shooting and driving feel good, and the level design works well within the exploration loop. Intelligent signifiers mean players can find whatever challenge they are looking for and meaningfully progress through that lane, be that stunt races, outposts, or plain story missions. Part of what makes the gameplay of Far Cry so addicting, however, is the ability to offer tranquility in the eye of a purely chaotic storm. Even in the constant oppression of the Rook Islands, the civil war in Kyrat, or the hostile takeover of Hope County, there are these tiny pockets of peace where it doesn't feel like you are on the run. Instead, it just feels like a destination. The beauty of America had moments where I could breathe it in, and once again, I feel like I say this every time with these games, I was blown away. Nature is at its best here, and the minimal buildings and overabundance of bunkers means that nature gets to flourish. What above-ground structures are here are often occupied by the cults, and in them, we see a refinement in the outpost system that keeps them fresh despite having so little changed. Maybe that's part of the message here. No matter how much things change, they always end up staying the same. Whether in the Caribbean, Nepal, or the USA, there's always someone seeking power, willing to trample upon others to reach it, and twisting their boots in to ensure they keep that power. The desire for people to resist that power, no matter the language, the culture, or the location, will always persevere, one way or another, until that power too becomes corrupt, and another resistance starts the cycle over again.